It's so crazy, it just might work. This week on Bloomberg Green.
If we're dealing with something as fundamental as the genetic makeup of species and thinking about putting them back out into the wild, the genie's out of the bottle.
The scientists trying to bring extinct species back from the dead and fix the food chain in the process.
With determination and ingenuity, humans have achieved incredible things, and there's no reason why we shouldn't achieve fusion.
The ever-receding fuel of the future, why nuclear fusion could be the answer to humanity's energy problem if we can only make it work.
The purpose of our paper was to provoke thought about whether a technology is feasible or whether it's just impossible out the box.
And if the ice caps are melting, why can't we just make more ice? We speak to the astrophysicist trying to refreeze the Arctic. I'm Anne-Marie Hordern, and this is Bloomberg Green. Nuclear fusion is the holy grail of green energy, near infinite power with no harmful waste. But this dream has proven out of reach for more than half a century. Governments around the world have invested in massive fusion projects with little to no success. But now a new generation of startups is aiming to crack the secret to the sun's power.
Atoms are constantly moving. The hotter they get, the faster they move. They also have a natural tendency to repel each other. But with enough heat and density, it's possible to merge atoms together. This is fusion, and it creates enormous amounts of energy. It's also a potentially inexhaustible source of clean power because it uses the most abundant element in the universe, hydrogen.
There are some people who think it's science fiction and it'll never happen. But it's not science fiction. The reason we know fusion works is because it works in the stars. In the sun, hydrogen is joining together to make helium, and this releases huge amounts of energy. Since scientists first figured out what was causing the sun to shine, they've been dreaming of harnessing this energy as a clean energy source on Earth.
One of the ways scientists are trying to achieve fusion is with machines called tokamaks. A tokamak is shaped like a donut or a cored apple, filled with a gas and surrounded by magnetic coils. Electricity runs through the center, heating the gas. When the particles are energized to the point that their electrons break free, the gas turns into a plasma. It can now be contained within the machine by a magnetic field, which stops the molten plasma from burning through the walls. Once the plasma reaches over 100 million degrees Celsius, the ions inside it start to collide and fuse. Among various fusion devices like stellarators, colliding beam fusion reactors, or magnetized target reactors, tokamaks are some of the oldest and most understood. General thinking with these machines was the bigger, the better. A compact tokamak capable of reaching fusion conditions was thought to be impossible, until about a decade ago, when Mikhail Gryaznovich did the maths.
I said, I've done my calculations, here they are. If something is wrong, please come and tell me that something is wrong. And my boss came to my office and said, he was very excited. He said, well, I've spent 6 hours doing some sums. I think you're right. I think it is possible. So I'm not a dreamer, I'm a builder.
Taking on the challenge, he co-founded Tokamak Energy. Here, in an ordinary business park near Oxford, the company is trying to build their fusion machine at a fraction of the time and money that it takes governments. Last year, this tokamak created a plasma as hot as the sun. But the team needs higher temperatures, so they're adding a new heating system and even more power. A number of other facilities have triggered the fusion reaction in the past.
For a split second, it's generated enough power to run thousands of homes. So if we know how to do it, what's holding fusion power back?
Well, so far, all the machines have used more power to run than they've generated from the reaction. To make fusion a viable energy source, the devices need to become much more efficient. One tokamak which promises to get us there is called ITER, but it's taken nearly 30 years to get it from concept to construction.
ITER, because of its size, it became a worldwide collaboration. And this has made it very political and very bureaucratic. And because it's taken so long, the prices have gone up.
The estimate has gone from $6 billion to $25 billion. That may sound like a lot, but to put it in perspective, the Beijing Olympics cost $40 billion.
Just for comparison, one country can afford to run a big sporting event, but they don't want to fund a project that could solve the world's energy problems. I think it's crazy, but that's the way it is.
But it's not all about the cost or the scale, but who can be the first to actually produce more energy than is being used in the process.
When it happens, that's like the Wright brothers moment where the plane finally takes off. And that's why working for a startup is so exciting, because you feel that you can make more progress. The fact that there are more and more startups coming into this space is really, really hopeful, because the fusion program has been drip-fed for decades, and then people wonder why we haven't yet achieved fusion. You don't achieve fusion by just keeping it barely alive. You have to put the money into it. And I'm hoping that through the startups, we can actually get enough investment into fusion to get it over the line. I know that, bottling the stars, if you like, is going to be hard, but with determination and ingenuity, humans have achieved incredible things, and there's no reason why we shouldn't achieve fusion.
Coming up, the changes that humanity has made to our planet are unprecedented, both in terms of size and speed. But what if we could wind back the clock? Up next, the scientists who are trying to reverse global warming and extinction itself. This is Bloomberg Green. From Bloomberg's headquarters in New York, I'm Anne-Marie Hordern, and this is Bloomberg Green. The human species has driven the planet's biodiversity into an unprecedented decline. With as many as 1 million species at risk, traditional conservation methods alone are struggling. And now a potential radical solution has entered the mix. Biotechnologies that have been developing in the wings are now being brought forward to potentially reverse the damage already done. So meet the scientists behind Deextinction.
The decline in biodiversity is a crucial issue that is largely overlooked in the public consciousness in terms of how important it really is. Our existence as humans is deeply intertwined with the health and flourishing of a number of non-human species.
If you destroy the environment, it's going to turn around and bite back.
We need to radically rethink our relationship to the natural world. We need to understand that we are a deeply entrenched part of it, certainly not separate from it. This is part of what is killing other species and eventually us too.
Traditional conservation methods alone are struggling to offset the speed at which we're losing species and habitats. Biotechnologies are now offering the hope of new, if not controversial, ways of saving endangered species.
Biotechnology offers everything from genetic insight to restoring diversity with cloning or technologies or doing gene editing to aid disease resistance, all the way to that moonshot of using all those technologies to restore something like a woolly mammoth or a passenger pigeon.
The process of resurrecting species like this is known as Deextinction, and it's one of the more complex and controversial applications of this biotechnology.
De-extinction is a scientific movement, we could say, an emerging space of researchers who are trying to use a variety of different biotechnologies in order to help recreate close approximate versions of extinct species so that they can create new animals that mimic extinct species and can go back out into the wild spaces where extinct species used to roam and carry out important ecological roles there that have disappeared since certain species went extinct.
The very first example of de-extinction, if you call it that, is the bucado, which is a Pyrenean ibex, so kind of a mountain goat. The last bucado died in Spain. It was a single animal, but they took some cells from its ear and preserved those. And years later, they used those cells to clone a bucado using a domestic goat as the surrogate. So they could create cells, implant an embryo in a goat, and the goat gave birth to a live bucado.
The species was brought back only to go extinct again just 10 minutes later due to lung defects. The 2003 resurrection of the bucado remains the closest that anyone has gotten to true de-extinction, at least for now. In 2017, George Church's Woolly Mammoth project captured the public's imagination and brought de-extinction back into conversation.
So de-extinction is really just a little bit of hybridization of using ancient DNA and some modern synthetic DNA to achieve a goal of, say, cold resistance or pathogen resistance.
Church hoped to adapt the genome of the woolly mammoth's closest living relative, the Asian elephant, to include a number of mammoth traits, in particular, how to thrive in the cold climate of the Arctic.
We are using the tools of paleogenomics, which is the ability to actually get DNA sequences from those extinct species from hundreds or thousands of years ago and look at their genetic code, compare it to their living relatives, and start to understand what are the unique fragments of DNA that made them do what they did in the environment. Two, there's now something called gene editing, which is most famously done with CRISPR-Cas9. It's an enzyme and RNA combination that basically is a homing system that allows scientists to target any region of DNA in a living cell's genome and make a cut and then make an edit to that area. So we could take the hemoglobin gene in an Asian elephant's genome and cut it and overwrite in its place the hemoglobin allele from a woolly mammoth, which will change how it bonds oxygen at different temperatures. And that's something that George Church's lab has already done in culture in a petri dish.
While altering the genome of living animals like the Asian elephant could help bring a version of extinct species back to life, it could also help to rescue a species which is itself endangered.
We want something that has all the advantages of cold resistance, possibly resistance to pathogens like the EHV virus that's almost extinction level harm to the Asian elephant, which is an endangered species. So you can consider it a hybrid, but we can use synthetic biology to, say, alter tusk length to avoid poachers. So there's a number of opportunities here that is not limited to de-extinction of genes.
Church wants to reintroduce his hybrids into the Arctic tundra, which he hopes will preserve an environment that's crucial to storing carbon. Science has proven de-extinction is possible, and the environmental argument for doing it is clear, yet questions still remain.
Doing de-extinction, there's a whole lot of unknowns, and especially when you're trying to think about a species like a woolly mammoth that's been gone for thousands of years. What are the prospects for being able to put this back in the appropriate kind of environment? Does woolly mammoth habitat even exist anymore? And if you go for very long extinctions, the further back you go, the more uncertainty, the less we know about the species, and the less likely there is to be a place for it now. The technical ability is outrunning our ability to think about, is this a sensible or a useful thing to do? And there's this concern that, if we're dealing with something as fundamental as the genetic makeup of species and thinking about putting them back out into the wild, the genie's out of the bottle.
So from engineering biology to engineering geology, there's a standard image of Earth as seen from space that we carry in our heads. Vast blue seas, green bands of forests, and frozen white caps on the top and bottom. By the summer of 2035, that may not be accurate, though. Scientists estimate that in just 15 years, Arctic summer sea ice could disappear for the first time in hundreds of thousands of years. But what if there was a way to stop it? I spoke with astrophysicist Steve Desch, who has made a radical proposal. If the ice is melting, why don't we just make more?
The Arctic, where the climate change is happening most rapidly and has some of the biggest impacts on the rest of the planet, So we explored the effects of pumping water from below the ice to the top of the ice to facilitate the ice freezing faster and surviving the Arctic summer. What we wanted to demonstrate was that pumping about a meter's worth of water across the Arctic was, while it's a big endeavor, it's not something that's actually impossible, and it is achievable using existing technologies. While it would be a large undertaking, it would not be impossible, and it could have measurable effects on the climate.
If it's a thought process, logistically, how could it actually work?
So what we envisioned in the paper is that you'd have to pump water across the Arctic and therefore have about one every tenth of a square kilometer, and have a pumping station that would use wind power that would raise the water above the surface of the ice. What we're thinking now is that it's possible to do this in a more centralized way, so that you could have, for example, one ship and it's using water cannons or something that would pump water.
It does feel like a massive undertaking, though, that has a really big price tag. How much would something like this cost?
You know, we were estimating something on the order of, hundreds of billions of dollars. And possibly you would have to repeat this every 10 years. This is something comparable to what the US government pays for large endeavors, things like the Iraq War, for example. So it's not something that is out of range of achievement if that's in the political will to do so.
So the paper came out in 2016. It was a thought process then. We're now in 2021, and you have a lab going. You're testing all this. Is it fair to say that this idea is gaining traction with the scientific community?
There's certainly a cohort of people, especially the younger generation, that feels like we need to know what our options are, what the pros and cons are. And there's definitely a contingent that feels that we shouldn't even be exploring these things. It's a moral hazard to do so because it just encourages the fossil fuel industry to do business as usual. There is no dedicated funding line among any government agencies to study geoengineering. So this is something that we're doing on a shoestring budget in our spare time.
It's interesting you mentioned geoengineering because it's so controversial, but do you find that it's potentially cooling off a little bit, that debate? Are more people willing to explore, given how dire some of the scientific projections are for places like the Arctic?
My perception is that geoengineering is becoming less unacceptable to explore simply because the risks are quickly being overtaken by the actual damage that we see being done. And we're running out of time to do things the right way. And let me just be clear, we don't view this as a cure-all either. We think that this is just one adaptation that we can undertake in one region of the world, and nothing is going to help unless we reduce CO2 emissions globally. So even by exploring this, it doesn't, I feel, undercut the argument that we must reduce CO2 emissions.
And just give us a sense of how dire the prospects are for the Arctic right now.
Well, the Arctic is quickly losing sea ice. We used to have, just in the 1980s, about a third of the ice in the Arctic would have been multi-year ice there for 5 years or more, and that is pretty much all gone. There's less than a few percent of the ice in the Arctic is multi-year ice, and so we rely on it to freeze every year. It has to start from scratch almost every few years. And the total amount of surface area covered by the ice has dropped by 10%. And with that loss of ice, we turn the Arctic from a white sheet of ice throughout much of the year to dark ocean, which absorbs sunlight. And so it's a vicious feedback where the warming begets more warming, and then it translates to warming globally.
Coming up, time, money, and the small matter of political will. These are the biggest impediments to innovation. We talk next with our resident climate expert about the feasibility of these projects and some others to watch out for. This is Bloomberg Green. From Bloomberg's headquarters in New York, I'm Anne-Marie Hordern, and this is Bloomberg Green. So from bringing life back to long-lost species to creating a miniature sun inside a reactor, we've been through some pie-in-the-sky ideas for this edition of Bloomberg Green. So let's get back to Earth with our resident climate expert, Akshat Rathi, to talk about the realities of these technologies. Akshat, let's start with fusion. Is it ever going to happen?
It is a butt of jokes that fusion is the future of power and has been and will remain so for the last 50 years. Well, things have changed a little bit since that joke was around, in that you now have multiple companies that have raised more than $1 billion that are looking to build these plants. And the diversity of ideas among these startups is also interesting. And so the chances of success of one of these startups goes up every year. And so whether it will come within this time frame that we need to tackle climate change is another question. But the question whether it will ever happen is increasingly a yes.
Okay, so we shouldn't lose hope just yet when it comes to fusion. In this episode, we also explored de-extinction. Is that something we should be focusing on, or should we be trying to keep the animals we have left alive?
Clearly, we are losing animals and species at an alarming rate. And so clearly conservation has to be a priority. But I think in the debate around de-extinction, we shouldn't take the end goal as the only marker of change. Because on the way to the end goal, the science that would be developed will have enormous consequences for other aspects of life and perhaps even human health. And so to not pursue de-extinction would probably be not a good idea, but whether the vast majority of the resources should go, that's very clearly towards conservation.
And what about geoengineering? It has a really bad reputation, at least in the recent years. What's feasible and what's helpful?
Geoengineering is a broad term. There are many different interventions that you can take to try and cool the Earth down, but they all suffer from the challenge that we are not tackling the core issue at hand, which is the emissions that are causing the warming. So any geoengineering proposals that come ought to come alongside reduction in emissions. Now, some of those geoengineering technologies will be very easy to implement, such as taking planes into the sky and injecting sulfur into the upper atmosphere that reflects sunlight. And others, like refreezing the Arctic, will be much harder because the energy required to do them is enormous. And so what we really now need is research into whether geoengineering should be done or not. And that is the thing that we should focus on.
Yeah, and it's quite divisive within the environmental community. All of these ideas, especially more ice in the Arctic, Akshat, are met with a lot of criticism that they're pretty far-fetched. But what kind of green technology that seems normal now, but would have been just as unbelievable, say, 50 or even 20 years ago?
Well, we don't think of working from home as a green technology, but imagine a pandemic that would have come in the 1990s. We would not have had the internet and digital devices to be able to do, at least for a portion of the population, working from home. So that clearly is a green technology. But on a less sexy side is the fact that we've never had electricity so cheap. And electricity is carbon-free. So solar and wind, you can get at 1 or 2 cents per kilowatt hour. And even fossil fuels in their historic prices have not been able to offer that kind of cheap electricity. And so we could do a lot with that in trying to decarbonize other sectors of the economy.
Akshat, thanks for keeping it real for us. Our climate expert, Akshat Rathi, there. That's it for this week's edition, but keep the conversation going. Follow us on Twitter @Climate. I'm Anne-Marie Hordern, and this is Bloomberg Green.